Fireside Tales for Wolfgang. Episode 48. Greetings and salutations. I'm Hunter Ackerman, here to read some classic literature for you. Maestro Dickens. So Dickens was a master serial writer, and I don't just mean that he was good with breakfast foods. Dickens would write books in installations, and he would publish them one at a time. When one of his books was just being released, people actually rioted trying to steal the new editions. Wow. People were really into literature. Instead of calling the chapters in this Christmas Carol, he calls them staves. He was deliberately going for something that felt and sounded like music notation, like a stave in music. Because the whole book is supposed to be a Christmas carol, and each chapter is part of the song. I'm thrilled to be part of something larger than myself. All of us together right now, you watching and listening to this right now, is kind of like the futuristic, technologically incorporated version of what Dickens meant to happen. He wanted people to come together as families, as communities, and share this incredible story. And I cannot tell you how thrilled I am that you all are joining us together on this journey and keeping alive this beautiful tradition that Dickens envisioned. This is part one of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Stave 1. Marley's Ghost. Marley was dead to begin with. There's no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon the exchange for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was dead as a doornail. Mind, I don't mean to say that I know of my own knowledge that there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade, but you will, therefore, permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was as dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew he was dead? Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and Marley were partners for I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend, and his sole mourner. The mention of Marley's funeral brings me back to the point I started from. There's no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I'm going to relate. If we were not perfectly convinced that Hamlet's father died before the play began, there would be nothing more remarkable in his taking a stroll at night in an easterly wind upon his own ramparts than there would be in any other middle-aged gentleman rashly turning out after dark in a breezy spot, say St. Paul's churchyard, for instance, literally to astonish his son's weak mind. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name. There it stood, years afterwards, above the warehouse door. Scrooge and Marley. The firm was known as Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people new to the business called Scrooge Scrooge, and sometimes they called him Marley, but he answered to both names. It was all the same to him. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire. Secret, self-contained, and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red and his thin lips blue. A bit of frost was on his head and on his eyebrows and his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature always about with him. He iced his office in the dog days and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, no wintry weather chill him. No wind that blew was bitterer than he. No falling snow was more intent upon its purpose, no pelting rain less open to entreaty. Nobody ever stopped him in the street to say with gladsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. No children asked him the time of day. And no woman ever once in all his life inquired the way to such and such a place. None of them of Scrooge. Even the blind men's dogs appeared to know him. And when they saw him coming on, they would tug their owners into doorways and up courts, and then would wag their tails as though they said, "No eye at all is better than an evil eye, Dark Master." But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked, to edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance. And he was what the knowing ones called nuts. Once upon a time, of all the good days in the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. It was cold, bleak, biting weather, foggy withal, and he could hear the people in the court outside go wheezing up and down, beating their hands upon their breasts and stamping upon the pavement stones to warm their feet. The city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark already. It had not been light all day, and candles were flaring in the windows of the neighboring offices. The fog came pouring in at every chink and keyhole, and this fog was so dense without that, although the court was of the narrowest, the houses opposite were mere phantoms. The door of Scrooge's counting house was open that he might keep his eye upon his clerk, who, in a dismal little cell beyond a sort of tank, was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal. But he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room, and so surely as the clerk came in with the shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part, wherefore the clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of strong imagination, he failed. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" cried a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly that this was the first intimation he had had of his approach. "Bah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug!" Scrooge's nephew had so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost that he was all in a glow. His face was ruddy and handsome, his eyes sparkled, and his breath smoked again. "Christmas a humbug, Uncle," said Scrooge's nephew. You don't mean that, I'm sure." "I do," said Scrooge.
Merry Christmas! What right have you to be merry? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough.
Come then, returned the nephew gaily. What right have you to be dismal? What reason have you to be morose? You're rich enough. Scrooge, having no better answer ready on the spur of the moment, said,
Bah!
again, and followed it up with,
Humbug!
Don't be cross, uncle, said the nephew.
What else can I be?
Returned the uncle.
When I live in such a world of fools as this. Merry Christmas. What's Christmas to you but a time for paying bills without money? A time for finding yourself a year older and not an hour richer. If I could work my will, said Scrooge indignantly, every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled in his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart.
Uncle, pleaded the nephew.
Nephew,
returned the uncle sternly.
Keep Christmas in your own way and let me keep it in mine.
Keep it? Repeated Scrooge's nephew. But you don't keep it.
Let me leave it alone, then,
said Scrooge.
Much good may it do you. Much good it has ever done you.
There are many things from which I might have derived good, by which I have not profited, I dare say, returned the nephew. Christmas, among the rest. But I'm sure I've always thought of Christmas time when it has come around, apart from the veneration due to its sacred name and origin, if anything belonging to it can be apart from that, is a good time. The only time I know of in the long calendar of the year when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely, and to think of people below them as if they really were fellow passengers to the grave, and not another separate race of creatures bound on their other journeys. And therefore, uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe that it has done me good and will do me good. And so I say, God bless it. The clerk in the tank involuntarily applauded. Becoming immediately sensible of the impropriety, he poked the fire and extinguished the last frail spark forever.
Let me hear another sound from you, said Scrooge, and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation.
Then, turning to his nephew, said,
You are quite a powerful speaker, sir.
And added,
I wonder you don't go into Parliament.
Don't be angry, uncle. Come, dine with us tomorrow. Scrooge said that he would see him. Yes, indeed he did. He went the whole length of the expression and said that he would see him in that extremity first. But why? Cried Scrooge's nephew. Why?
Why did you get married?
Said Scrooge. Because I fell in love.
Because you fell in love,
growled Scrooge, as if that were the only one thing in the world more ridiculous than a Merry Christmas.
Good afternoon, sir.
Nay, uncle, but you never came to see me before that happened. Why give it as a reason for not coming now?
Good afternoon, sir,
said Scrooge. I want nothing from you. I ask nothing of you. Why cannot we be friends?
Good afternoon, sir,
said Scrooge. I am sorry with all my heart to find you so resolute. We've never had any quarrel to which I have been a party, but I have made the trial in homage to Christmas, and I'll keep my Christmas humor to the last. So, a Merry Christmas, Uncle.
Good afternoon, sir, said Scrooge.
And a Happy New Year,
Good afternoon, sir,
said Scrooge. His nephew left the room without an angry word. He stopped at the outer door to bestow the greetings of the season on the clerk, who, cold as he was warmer than Scrooge, for he returned them cordially.
There's another fellow,
muttered Scrooge.
My clerk with 15 shillings a week and a wife and family talking about Merry Christmas. I'll retire to Bedlam.
This lunatic, in letting Scrooge's nephew out, had let 2 other people in. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, and now stood with their hats off in Scrooge's office. They had books and papers in their hands and bowed to him. Scrooge and Marley's, I believe, said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list. Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?
Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years,
Scrooge replied.
He died 7 years ago, this very night.
We have no doubt his liberality is well represented by his surviving partner, said the gentleman, presenting his credentials. This was certainly true. Scrooge and Marley had been 2 kindred spirits. Scrooge frowned and shook his head and handed the credentials back. At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge, said the gentleman, taking up a pen, it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and the destitute who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessaries. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comforts, sir.
Are there no prisons?
Asked Scrooge. Plenty of prisons, said the gentleman, laying down the pen again.
And the union workhouses?
Demanded Scrooge.
Are they still in operation?
They are still, returned the gentleman. I wish I could say they were not.
The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigor then, said Scrooge.
Both very busy, sir.
Go. I was afraid from what you said at first that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course, said Scrooge. I am very glad to hear it.
A few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We choose this time because it is a time of all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for?
Nothing,
Scrooge replied.
Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry either. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there.
Many can't go there. And frankly, many would rather die.
If they would rather die, said Scrooge, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. It's not my business, Scrooge returned. It's enough for a man to understand his own business and not to interfere with other people's. Mine occupies me constantly. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Meanwhile, the fog and darkness thickened. Foggier yet, and colder. The owner of one scant young nose gnawed and mumbled by the hungry cold as bones are gnawed by dogs, stooped down at Scrooge's keyhole to regale him with a Christmas carol. But at the first sound of "God bless you, merry gentlemen, may nothing you dismay," Scrooge seized the ruler with such energy of action that the singer fled in terror, leaving the keyhole to the fog. At length, the hour of shutting up the counting-house arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge dismounted from his stool and tacitly admitted the fact to the expectant clerk in the tank, who instantly snuffed his candle out and put on his hat.
"You'll want all day tomorrow, I suppose,"
said Scrooge.
"Right, if it's convenient, sir."
"It's not convenient,"
said Scrooge.
"and it's not fair. If I was to stop half a crown for it, you'd think yourself ill-used, I'll be bound."
The clerk smiled faintly.
"And yet,"
said Scrooge,
"you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wages for no work."
The clerk observed that
"It was only once a year."
"A poor excuse for picking a man's pockets every 25th of December,"
said Scrooge, buttoning his greatcoat to the chin.
"But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier next morning."
The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge walked out with a growl. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed. He lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms. It was old enough and dreary enough, for nobody lived in it but Scrooge. Now, it is a fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door, except that it was very large. It is also a fact that Scrooge had seen this knocker night and morning during his whole residence in that place. It is also a fact that Scrooge had as little of what is called fancy about him as any man in the city of London. Let it also be borne in mind that Scrooge had not bestowed one thought on Marley since his last mention of his 7 years dead partner that afternoon. And then, let any man explain to me, if he can, how it happened that Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without its undergoing any intermediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face. It was not in impenetrable shadow, as the other objects in the yard were, but had a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It was not angry or ferocious, but looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up on its ghostly forehead. The hair was curiously stirred. Though the eyes were wide open, they were perfectly motionless. That, and its livid color, made it horrible. As Scrooge stared fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. To say that he was not startled would be untrue, but he put his hand upon the key, turned it sturdily, walked in, and lighted his candle. He did pause, but there was nothing on the back of the door except the screws and nuts that held the knocker on. So he said, "Puh!" and closed it with a bang. The sound resounded through the house like thunder. He fastened the door and walked up the stairs, slowly. Up Scrooge went, but before he shut his heavy door, he walked through his rooms to see that all was right. Quite satisfied, he closed his door and locked himself in. Double locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus secured against surprise, he put on his dressing gown and slippers and his nightcap and sat down before the fire to take his gruel.
Humbug,
said Scrooge. His glance happened to rest upon a bell. It was with great astonishment that he saw this bell begin to swing. It swung so softly in the outset that it scarcely made a sound, but soon it rang out loud, and so did every bell in the house. Scrooge then remembered to have heard the ghosts in haunted houses were described as dragging chains. The cellar door flew open with a booming sound, and then he heard the noise much louder on the floors below. Then, coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards his door.
It's humbug still,
said Scrooge.
I won't believe it.
His color changed, though, when, without a pause, the apparition came on through the heavy door and passed into the room right before his eyes. Upon its coming in, the dying flame leapt up as though it cried, "I know him, Marley's ghost," and fell again. The same face. The very same. The chain he drew was clasped about his middle. It was long and wound about him like a tail. And it was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him and looking through his waistcoat, could see the 2 buttons on his coat behind. Though Scrooge looked the phantom through and saw it standing before him, though he felt the chilling influence of its death-cold eyes and marked the very texture of the folded kerchief bound about its head and chin, which wrapper he had not observed before, he was still incredulous and fought against his senses.
How now?
Said Scrooge, caustic and cold as ever.
What do you want with me?
Much. This was Marley's voice, no doubt about it.
Who are you?
Ask me who I was.
Who were you then?
Said Scrooge, raising his voice. In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley.
Can you sit down?
Asked Scrooge, looking doubtfully at him. I can.
Do it then.
The ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace, as if he were quite used to it. You don't believe in me, observed the ghost.
I don't,
said Scrooge. What evidence would you have of my reality, beyond that of your own senses?
I don't know,
said Scrooge. Why do you doubt your senses?
Because, said Scrooge, a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes the senses unreliable. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. That's what you are. You're an old potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever else you are.
The ghost sat perfectly motionless. Its hair and skirts and tassels were still agitated as by the hot vapor from an oven.
Humbug, I tell you! Humbug!
At this, the spirit raised a frightful cry and shook its chain with such a dismal and appalling noise. But how much greater was Scrooge's horror when the phantom, taking off the bandage round its head, its lower jaw dropped down upon its breast. Scrooge fell upon his knees and clasped his hands before his face. "Mercy!" he said. "Dreadful apparition! Why do you trouble me?" "Man of the worldly mind," replied the ghost, "do you believe in me or not?" "I do," said Scrooge. I must. But why do spirits walk the earth? And why do they come to me?" "It is required of every man," the ghost returned, "that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men, and travel far and wide. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world. Oh, woe is me, and witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth, and turned to happiness." Again the spectre raised a cry and shook its chain and wrung its shadowy hands. "You are fettered," said Scrooge, trembling. Tell me why." "I wear the chain I forged in life," replied the ghost. "I made it link by link, and yard by yard. I girded it on of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you?" Scrooge trembled more and more. "Or would you know," pursued the ghost, "the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was fully as heavy and as long as this 7 Christmas Eves ago." Scrooge glanced about him, but he could see nothing. "Jacob," he said imploringly. "Oh, Jacob Marley, tell me more. Speak comfort to me, Jacob." "I have none to give you, Ebenezer Scrooge," the ghost replied. "I cannot rest. I cannot stay. I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting house, mark me. In life, my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole. And weary journeys lie before me."
"7 years dead," mused Scrooge. "And traveling all the time."
"The whole time," said the ghost. "No rest, no peace. Incessant torture of remorse."
"Well, do you travel fast?" said Scrooge.
"On the wings of the wind," replied the ghost.
"You might have got over a great quantity of ground in 7 years,"
said Scrooge. The ghost, on hearing this, set up another cry and clanked its chain so hideously in the dead silence of the night. No space of regret can make amends for one life's opportunities misused. Yet such was I. Oh, such was I.
"But you were always a good man of business, Jacob,"
faltered Scrooge, who now began to apply this to himself. "Business?" cried the ghost, wringing its hands again. "Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, benevolence were all my business." It held up its chain at arm's length and flung it heavily upon the ground again. "At this time of the rolling year," the spectre said, I suffer most. Hear me, cried the ghost.
My time is nearly gone. I will, said Scrooge, but don't be hard upon me, Jacob.
I have sat invisible beside you many and many a day. I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate. A chance and hope, Ebenezer.
You were always a good friend to me, said Scrooge. Thank you.
You will be haunted, resumed the ghost, by 3 spirits.
Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob?
He demanded in a faltering voice. It is.
I think I'd rather not,
said Scrooge. Without their visits, said the ghost, you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow when the bell tolls 1.
Couldn't I take them all at once and just have it over with, Jacob?
Hinted Scrooge. Expect the second on the night at the same hour. The third upon the next night, when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more. And look that, for your own sake, you remember what has passed between us. When it had said these words, the spectre took its wrapper from the table and bound it round its head as before. Scrooge ventured to raise his eyes again and found his supernatural visitor confronting him in an erect attitude with its chain wound over and about its arm. The apparition walked backwards from him, and at every step it took, the window raised itself a little, so that when the spectre reached it, it was wide open. Scrooge followed to the window. Desperate in his curiosity, he looked out. The air was filled with phantoms, wandering hither and thither in restless haste, and moaning as they went. Every one of them wore chains like Marley's ghost. None were free. Many had been personally known to Scrooge in their lives. These creatures faded into mist, and the night became as it had been when he walked home. Scrooge closed the window. He tried to say, "Hump," but stopped at the first syllable. Then he went straight to bed without undressing and fell asleep upon the instant. Stave 2. The first of the 3 spirits. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that he listened for the hour. To his great astonishment, 12. It was past 2 when he went to bed. The clock was wrong. An icicle must have gotten into the works. 12?
Why, it isn't possible, said Scrooge, that I have slept through a whole day and far into another night. It isn't possible that anything has happened to the sun and that this is 12 at noon.
He was obliged to rub the frost off with the sleeve of his dressing gown. It was still very foggy and extremely cold, and there was no noise of people running to and fro and making a great stir, as there unquestionably would have been if night had become bright day. This was a great relief. Scrooge went to bed again and thought it over. The more he thought, the more perplexed he was. Marley's ghost bothered him exceedingly. Was it a dream or not? Scrooge lay in this state until the chime had gone 3/4 more, when he remembered all of a sudden that the ghost had warned him of a visitation when the bell tolled 1. Ding dong.
The hour itself, said Scrooge triumphantly, and nothing else.
He spoke before the hour bell sounded, which it now did with a deep lull, hollow, melancholy 1. Light flashed up in the room upon the instant, and the curtains of his bed were drawn aside by a hand, and Scrooge found himself face to face with the unearthly visitor. It was a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child as like an old man. Its hair was white, as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle in it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. The arms were very long and muscular, the hands the same, as if its hold were of uncommon strength. Its legs and feet, most delicately formed, were bare. It wore a tunic of the purest white, and round its waist was bound a lustrous belt, the sheen of which was beautiful. It held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, and its dress was trimmed with summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head there sprang a bright, clear jet of light, by which all this was visible. It also had a great conical extinguisher for a cap, which it now held under its arm.
Are you the spirit, sir, whose coming was foretold to me?
Asked Scrooge. I am. The voice was soft and gentle.
Who and what are you?
Scrooge demanded. I am the ghost of Christmas past.
Long past?
Inquired Scrooge. No. Your past, Ebenezer Scrooge. Scrooge then made bold to inquire what business brought him there. Your welfare, said the ghost. It put out its strong hand as it spoke and clasped him gently by the arm. Rise now, and walk with me.
I am a mortal, Scrooge remonstrated, and liable to fall.
Bear but a touch of my hand there, said the spirit, laying it upon his heart, and you shall be upheld, and more than this. The darkness and the mist had vanished, for it was a clear, cold winter day with snow upon the ground.
Good heaven,
said Scrooge, clasping his hands together as he looked about him.
I was bred in this place. I was a boy here.
Your lip is trembling, said the ghost. And what is that upon your cheek? Scrooge muttered, with an unusual catching in his voice, that it was a pimple, and begged the ghost to lead him where he would. You recollect the way? Inquired the spirit.
Recollect it? Remember it? Cried Scrooge with fervor. I could walk it blindfold.
Strange to have forgotten it for so many years, observed the ghost. Let us go on. They walked along the road, Scrooge recognizing every gate, every post, every tree, until a little market town appeared in the distance, with its bridge, its church, and winding river. These are but the shadows of the things that have been, said the ghost. They have no consciousness of us. The jocund travelers came on, and as they came, Scrooge knew and named them every one. Why was he rejoiced beyond all bounds to see them? Why was he filled with gladness when he heard them give each other Merry Christmas? What was Merry Christmas to Scrooge? What good had it ever done him?
"The school is not quite deserted," said the ghost. "A solitary child, neglected by his friends, is left there still." Scrooge said he knew it, and he sobbed. They went to a door at the back of the house. It opened before them and disclosed a long, bare, melancholy room. A lonely boy was reading near a feeble fire, and Scrooge wept to see his poor, forgotten self as he had used to be. "I wish," Scrooge muttered after drying his eyes with his cuff, "but it's too late. It's too late now." "What is the matter?" asked the spirit.
"Nothing," said Scrooge. "Nothing. There was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night. I should like to have given him something, that's all."
The ghost smiled thoughtfully and waved its hand, saying as it did so,
"Let us see another Christmas."
Scrooge's former self grew larger at the words, and the room became a little darker, and there he was, alone again. When all the other boys had gone home for the jolly holidays, he was not reading now, but walking up and down despairingly. Scrooge looked toward the door. It opened, and a little girl, much younger than the boy, came darting in, and putting her arms about his neck and kissing him, addressed him as,
"A dear, dear brother. I've come to bring you home, dear, dear brother,"
said the child, clasping her tiny hands and bending down to laugh.
"To bring you home, home, home." "Home, little fawn?"
returned the boy.
"Yes,"
said the child, brimful of glee.
"Home, for good and all. Father's so much kinder than he used to be. He spoke so gently to me one dear night, and that I was afraid not to ask him once more if you might come home. And he said, yes, you should. And he sent me in a coach to bring you. And you're to be a man,"
said the child, opening her eyes.
"and are never to come back here. But first, we're all to be together all the Christmas long, and have the merriest time in all the world."
You are quite a woman, little fawn," exclaimed the boy.
"Always a delicate creature, whom a breath might have withered," said the ghost. "But she had a large heart."
"So she had,"
cried Scrooge. "She died a woman," said the ghost, "and had, as I think, children."
"One child,"
Scrooge returned.
"True," said the ghost. "Your nephew."
Scrooge seemed uneasy in his mind and answered briefly, "Yes." Although they had but that moment left the school behind them, they were now in the busy thoroughfares of a city. It was made plain enough by the dressing of the shops that here, too, it was Christmas time again. It was evening, and the streets were lighted up. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door and asked Scrooge if he knew it.
"Know it," said Scrooge. "I was apprenticed here."
They went in. At sight of an old gentleman in a Welsh wig, sitting behind a high desk that, if he had been 2 inches taller, he might have knocked his head against the ceiling, Scrooge cried in great excitement,
"Why, it's old Fezziwig! Oh, bless his heart, it's Fezziwig alive! Alive again!"
Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious waistcoat, laughed all over himself, and called out in a comfortable, rich, fat, jovial voice, "Right ho there, Ebenezer Dick!" Scrooge's former self, now grown a young man, came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow apprentice. "Ho, ho, my boys!" said Fezziwig. "No more work tonight. Christmas Eve, Dick. Christmas Eve, Ebenezer. Let's have the shutters up," cried old Fezziwig with a sharp clap of his hands, "before a man can say Jack Robinson." You wouldn't believe how those two fellows went at it. Clear away. There was nothing they wouldn't have cleared away or couldn't have cleared away with old Fezziwig looking on. It was done in a minute, and the warehouse was as snug and warm and dry and bright a ballroom as you would desire to see upon a winter's night. In came a fiddler with a music book, and in came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast, substantial smile. In came the 3 little Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In came the 6 young followers whose hearts they had broken. In came all the young men and women employed in the business. In they all came, one after another. Old Fezziwig, clapping his hands to stop the dance, cried out, "Right well done, sirs!" There were more dances, and there was cake, and there was a great piece of cold roast. There were mince pies and plenty of beer. Then old Fezziwig stood out to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig. Top couple, too. When the clock struck 11, this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on either side of the door, shaking hands with every person as he or she went out, wished him or her a Merry Christmas. During the whole of this time, Scrooge had acted like a man out of his wits. His heart and soul were in the scene, and with his former self. It was not until now that he remembered the ghosts and became conscious that it was looking full upon him, while the light upon its head burned very clear. "A small matter," said the ghost, "to make these silly folks so full of gratitude." The spirit signed to him to listen to the 2 apprentices who were pouring out their hearts in praise of Fezziwig. Why is it not? He has spent but a few pounds of your mortal money. Is that so much that he deserves this praise?" It isn't that," said Scrooge, heated by the remark and speaking unconsciously like his former self. "It isn't that, Spirit. He has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome. The happiness he gives is quite as great as if it cost a fortune." He felt the spirit's glance and stopped. "What is the matter?" asked the ghost. "Nothing particular," said Scrooge. "Something, I think," the ghost insisted. "No," said Scrooge. "No. I should like to be able to say a word or two to my clerk just now, that's all." His former self turned down the lamps as he gave utterance to the wish, and Scrooge and the ghost again stood side by side in the open air. "My time grows short," observed the spirit. "Quick!" Scrooge was not alone, but sat by the side of a fair young girl, in whose eyes there were tears. "It matters little," she said softly. "To you, very little. Another idol has displaced me, and if it can cheer and comfort you in time to come, as I would have tried to do, I have no just cause to grieve.
What idol has displaced you?
He rejoined. A golden one.
There is nothing on which the world is so hard as poverty.
You fear the world too much, she answered gently. I have seen your nobler aspirations fall off one by one until the master passion, gain, engrosses you, have I not?
Well, what then? He retorted. Even if I have grown so much wiser, what then? Am I not changed toward you?
She shook her hand, shook her head. Our contract is an old one. It was made when we were both poor and content to be so. You are changed, Ebenezer. You are changed. When it was made, you were another man.
I was a boy,
he said impatiently.
Tell me,
would you seek me out and try to win me now? Oh, no. I release you, with a full heart, for the love of him you once were. You may have pain in this for a very, very brief time. May you be happy in the life you have chosen. She left him, and they parted.
Spirit,
said Scrooge.
show me no more. Conduct me home. Why do you delight to torture me?
One shadow more, exclaimed the ghost. They were in another scene and place. A room, not very large or handsome, but full of comfort. Near to the winter fire sat a beautiful young girl, so like the last that Scrooge believed it was the same. Then he saw Belle, now a comely matron, sitting opposite her daughter. A knocking at the door was heard, and such a rush immediately ensued that she, with laughing face, was borne toward it, just in time to greet the father, who came laden with Christmas toys and presents.
Oh, yeah, Belle,
said the husband, turning to his wife with a smile.
I saw an old friend of yours this afternoon.
Oh? Who was it?
Mr. Scrooge. I passed his office window. He had a candle inside. I could scarcely help seeing him. His partner lies upon the point of death, I hear. And there he sat alone.
Quite alone in the world, I do believe.
Spirit,
said Scrooge in a broken voice.
Remove me from this place.
I told you these were shadows of the things that have been, said the ghost. That they are what they are. Do not blame me.
Remove me, Scrooge exclaimed. I cannot bear it. Leave me. Take me back. Haunt me no longer.
The ghost, with no visible resistance on its own part, was undisturbed by any effort. Scrooge seized the conical extinguisher cap and, by a sudden action, pressed it down upon its head. Scrooge was conscious of being exhausted and overcome by an irresistible drowsiness. And further, of being in his own bedroom. He had barely time to reel to bed before he sank into a heavy winter's sleep. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Fireside Tales for Wolfgang. You can view more of my work at Hunter's Acoustic Cabin. Directed by Hunter Ackerman. Produced by GWC Productions. In memory of Wolfgang Beastly. Originally broadcast on GWC Productions' YouTube channel, Caps Media Television Channel 6 in Ventura on KPPQ LP Ventura at 104.1 FM and on the KPPQ Podcast Network.
Episodes can also be viewed on Pasadena Media, either on Spectrum Charter Channel 32 or on AT&T Uverse Channel 99.